Thursday, 6th of March, 1987, off the coast of Zeebrugge, Belgium. A series of small vessels hurriedly head out of the harbour and head towards the approaches to the port. An SOS had been received. When the rescuers arrived, they found that she had rolled completely onto her side and settled in the mud, with some survivors desperately clinging to the hull, whilst many more were still trapped inside, shivering in the dark. How had this happened? How had a modern ship managed to sink so quickly and so soon after leaving port in calm waters? Today, Descent into Darkness looks at Britain's worst maritime disaster since the Titanic, the sinking of the Herald of Free Enterprise. Background. The MS Herald of Free Enterprise was a so-called roll-on, roll-off car ferry that plied her trade between the UK and the European continent. She was built by Schichau Unterwasser in Bremerhaven, Germany, being launched on the 21st of December 1979. She was the middle child of a class of 3 ships, the others being the Spirit of Free Enterprise and the Pride of Free Enterprise. She was designed for rapid loading and unloading of vehicles thanks to her large bow and stern doors that allowed her to quickly nose in to a double link-span jetty and have the vehicle owners drive their own cars on and off the ship under the supervision and guidance of the crew. Both loading and unloading were able to be carried out simultaneously thanks to the double-ended layout, where port facilities allowed for it. She was a little over 432 feet long and 76 feet in the beam for a gross tonnage of 7,951.5 tons at full load. She was pushed along by 3 Sulzer-built 12ZV engines, producing a total of 23,967 shaft horsepower for a top speed of 22 knots or 25 miles per hour. She could carry a total of 1,400 people, including her 80 crew, and had a capacity for 81 cars, 3 buses, and 47 lorries. The nature of her work necessitated her owners, Townsend Torrenson, operating on very tight schedules to remain in profit and to not incur hefty harbour fees. And so, speed was of the essence when it came to unloading the previous vehicles and getting the new ones on for the return trip. Thankfully, her crew were very well practiced in this, and for 6 years the ship happily chugged back and forth between Dover and Zeebrugge, day and night, being required to complete 4 round trips every day. Prelude to disaster. The Herald arrived in Zeebrugge in the mid-afternoon on the 6th of March 1987, after completing yet another uneventful 4.5-hour journey from Dover. She pulled up to her usual berth in the harbour, shore crew tying her mooring lines to the bollards. Very quickly afterwards, the loading doors were opened and the cars began streaming steadily off the ship, down the link span to the quayside. She had only 90 minutes to ready herself for the return trip. The link span at Zeebrugge was only a single level and could not be raised high enough for the loading of vehicles onto E-deck, but standard practice was to flood the ship's bow ballast tanks, which would allow her to settle low enough for the link span to reach. However, on the night of the sinking, most likely out of haste to maintain the schedule, this extra water was not pumped out before departure, as it should have been. There were plans afoot to make modifications to both the ship and the link span to remove this need, but fate had other ideas for the Herald of Free Enterprise. At around 16:30, the Herald's assistant bosun, Mark Stanley, had just finished the tedious job of cleaning the car deck with a mop and bucket, ready for the return trip to Dover. Thankfully, now that he had finished, a nice hour-long break awaited him. He headed up to his quarters, knowing that he would have to be back on duty just before cast-off at 1800. By 1700, all the disembarking vehicles were off and the new embarkees were beginning to fill up the car deck. A lot of the passengers coming aboard were British tourists, taking advantage of an offer of reduced prices for the cross-channel ferries, some even being on day-trip pub crawls, which the regular ferry timetable allowed them. The cheap deal meant that this evening's trip back would be at full capacity. By 1745, vehicles were still coming aboard, and the crew were frantically trying to get everyone on as quickly as possible with departure time looming. They only managed to finish 3 minutes before time. Sadly, this was far too late for all the final checks to be done. A crewman, Lee Cornelius, stretched a safety chain across the last line of cars between them and the bow doors. Once the loading of the ship had been completed, First Officer Leslie Sable radioed up to the bridge to inform Captain David Lowry, a man of 10 years' experience, who was keen to get underway as they were already falling behind schedule. Sable then left the car deck to assume his departure position on the bridge. All other crew members left the lower decks to report to their respective departure posts. Crucially, none of the crewmen leaving the lower deck had thought to ensure that the bow doors were closed, or at least in the process of closing. The sinking. At 18:05, the mooring lines were let go, and the Herald's engines roared into life, and the ship began to inch away from the quayside. They were only 5 minutes late, and Captain Lowry was hoping that, due to the calm weather reports he'd been receiving, he may perhaps be able to make up lost time if he pushed on a little harder. Aboard, the atmosphere was high amongst the passengers, having had a great day out in Belgium. None of them were even remotely worried about the crossing. By 1824, the Herald had reached the outer limits of the Zeebrugge harbour, and Captain Lowry decided to increase the speed to 18 knots to try and gain as much time back as possible. But as the ship picked up pace, suddenly she veered off course and lurched over to starboard. Everyone aboard felt it as a jolt, throwing a few off balance. Captain Lowry wrestled with the wheel on the bridge to try and bring the ship back on course and level, but thankfully the vessel righted herself, and all appeared to return to normal. A few seconds later, a crewman who had returned to the lower car deck shouted frantically for the ship's assistant purser. When the assistant purser arrived, he saw to his horror that large amounts of water were sloshing around the car deck, with lots more coming down from the upper deck. He raced back to his post, where he had left his radio. Unfortunately, he couldn't raise anyone on the bridge. Then at 1828, the Herald listed once more, this time much more violently, a full 30 degrees over to port. The cars and other vehicles on the cargo deck all began to shift over in that direction, making the list even more severe. Panic shouts rang out amongst the passengers as people were thrown around like rag dolls. Up on the bridge, the severity and suddenness of the list caused Captain Lowry to lose his balance, and he fell, struck his head, knocking him unconscious. Thousands of tons of water poured in through broken windows as the ship heeled over further and further. Passengers clung to whatever they could to stop them from plunging into the frigid cold waters of the English Channel. The Herald of Free Enterprise went over so quickly that there wasn't even time to issue a mayday call. Within a minute and a half, the ferry now lay on her port side. Thankfully, half of her was held above the surface by a sandbar underneath. As she came to rest on the sandbar, her electrical systems failed, plunging everyone into darkness, creating an even greater panic as friends and family tried desperately to locate each other and stay together as best they could in the dark, scream-filled air. Rescue efforts and aftermath. At the same time as the Herald went over, a Belgian dredging vessel named Sanderus was only 1 kilometre from the ship. Her crew saw her capsizing through the gloom of the gathering night, and then her lights flickered and went out. Immediately they radioed in a mayday call to the harbour controller, who in turn ordered all nearby vessels to come to the Herald's assistance. The passengers on board did not have long in the freezing water. Hypothermia risked setting in and making them lose consciousness in as little as 20 minutes. Ships from all over Zeebrugge harbour raced towards the stricken ferry. By 1840, 12 minutes after the sinking, the tugboat Seahorse pulled alongside and switched on her lights to illuminate as much as they could. The crew of the Seahorse leapt onto the exposed starboard side of the Herald and began smashing at the windows to help people out of the wreck. 3 minutes later, and the ship had finally stopped shifting, the water levels inside had stabilised, bringing a small sigh of relief to those still trapped. More and more ships and boats arrived on scene over the next few minutes and began assisting in the rescue. Many people were pulled out from the wreck, then escorted to waiting lifeboats or to a helicopter hovering overhead. Rescue vessels also brought scuba divers with them. Despite the inherent dangers of entering a potentially unstable shipwreck, they waved caution to the wind to hopefully save even more people trapped below in air pockets. Everyone worked quickly, knowing that time was of the essence to get people out of the water as quickly as possible. Divers swam through the wreckage, debris, and the dead, all while calling out to anyone who might hear them. As the night plodded on, the steady stream of survivors began to slow to a trickle, and by 2100, the dead passengers being retrieved steadily grew in number. One survivor, Simon Osborne, described his seemingly endless wait for rescue in the eerie darkness thusly. There were these people shouting and screaming, but as time went on, it became less and less. Simon's life was saved when he heard rescue workers breaking glass near him, and he swam towards the noise. Once the rope was tied around him and he was pulled out, in a mixture of extreme shock, cold and exhaustion, it all caught up with him, and he lost consciousness. Thankfully, his salvation had come just in the nick of time. The last survivors pulled from the wreck were just barely clinging to life from the onset of hypothermia. Nearby hospitals on land became crowded with a large influx of severely injured and walking wounded. By 02:45, over 8 hours after the sinking, the rapidly rising tide began to create dangerous currents in and around the wreck that threatened to hamper any further efforts and hopes to find any more survivors. They were forced to suspend all operations until dawn brought with it the ebb tide. With heavy hearts, the valiant rescue crews withdrew from the wreck and waited, knowing that there could well be more people desperately hoping to be found. But as the night turned into morning, the confidence of finding more people alive started to wane. Everyone who was not brought up in the night was now presumed dead, the dreadful news being passed on to anxious survivors, with grief now reigning amongst all. In all, 193 people perished in the disaster. Raising an investigation. Investigations into the sinking began the very next morning. Maritime accident specialists were brought out to the wreck to examine it for signs that could have caused the disaster. The Herald was still very much intact, save for loose fixtures and fittings on the inside that had been upset everywhere. Whilst there were no signs of collision or grounding from what they could see on the exposed starboard side, when they made their way around to the bow, they made a shocking discovery. The bow loading doors were still wide open. Straight away, the media leapt on this revelation, dubbing them the Doors of Death. Sick name for a metal band. It was immediately apparent that this was to blame for the sinking. But then again, not quite. The doors were 3.5 meters above the waterline at normal load, and the sea that night was virtually a flat calm. So how had the water managed to gain ingress? It sure as hell didn't climb up into the ship. And more importantly, why the hell were they still open in the first place? At first, it was thought that the ship might have grounded on the sandbar that she had come to rest on, possibly then damaging the bow doors, causing them to open. This theory was lent some credence when the radar logs from the Zeebrugge Port Authority showed that the Herald had veered off course a few points to starboard just before she capsized, crucially away from the deep water channel that was constantly dredged by ships such as the Sanderas to keep it clear from the ever-shifting silt. However, the radar shows that she never hit the sandbar, but thanks to its proximity, it saved the ship from fully submerging, which no doubt led to many more lives being saved. A small grace to be gained from an otherwise awful tragedy. The fact that she had drifted off course gave the conclusion that the ship was already in trouble before the sinking. So why had it not been radioed in? Because of the location of her sinking, it was impossible for the wreck to remain where it was, as it was fouling the shipping lane directly in and out of Zeebrugge, and so she had to be raised and moved away for scrapping. This would be no mean achievement, but thankfully the salvagers were up to the task. Zeebrugge Port Authority man Guido de Ruder was the man who had received the initial Mayday call and relayed it on behalf of the Herald from the Sanderas. When he was questioned, he reported that the captain of the dredger claimed that he thought he saw the bow doors were open before the vessel sank, as he could see internal lights from the car deck. If this was true, and the Herald had cast off without closing her doors, Captain Lurie and his crew would have some very serious questions to answer, and could possibly face indictment for corporate manslaughter. The inquiry questioned the surviving members of the crew, particularly the ship's bosun, Terence Ayling, who was the last person to leave the car deck. When asked why he did not close the bow doors, he weakly replied that it was not his job, and that he was not on duty at the time. Indeed, it was normally the assistant bosun's job to ensure the closing of the doors, but at the same time, that assistant bosun, Mark Stanley, had returned to his cabin for a break after he'd finished scrubbing down the car deck, and so was nowhere to be seen when the ship had cast off. Ultimately, the job of supervising the loading came down to First Officer Leslie Sable. He should have ensured, once the cars were all safely aboard and secured, that the bow doors were closed. First Officer Sable was under immense pressure to get the ship loaded and ready for the off as quick as possible. If he did not, the highly competitive nature of the industry could have seen him receive a severe bollocking from his superiors. This could have been what led to him leaving the car deck as quickly as he did, rushing to his departure station. But in doing so, he failed to ensure the final part of his supervisory duties, that the doors were closed. Further to this, crewman Lee Cornelius, who had stretched the safety chain across the deck, seemingly didn't bother to ask the question why the doors had yet to be closed, and didn't bother to escalate that vital information up the chain of command, or take it upon himself to close them. He could not have failed to notice that they were still open. The doors were only a few feet in front of him. If nothing, the draft and the fact that he would have been able to see the other side of the harbour from inside the ship should have been a dead giveaway. Instead, both Sable and Cornelius had rushed to leave the car deck to take up their post for departure. It is telling that the man whose actual job it was to operate the hydraulic system that closed the bow doors, Mark Stanley, had not returned to the car deck after his break and before departure. Instead, Stanley had fallen asleep in his cabin and was overdue returning to duty. Perhaps both Sable and Cornelius had made the mistaken assumption that Stanley would be down any minute to close the doors. Lee Cornelius revealed that this was the case in an interview, that the job of closing the doors generally tended to be just whoever was around, rather than just one man's job. He said, "Sometimes when we left and completed loading, one of the guys on the main deck would shut the bow doors, and that night we didn't. We left them open and expected Mark to come down and shut them when we were finished." Instead, the man who should have done it was still pushing out Zeds in his cabin, and the other guys had not bothered to stick around until the job was fully completed. Sable should have remained on station to double-check that all was well, safe, and ready to go. He failed in that duty, and under questioning it became apparent that it was not the first time that he had left the car deck before time either. Even more troubling was the fact that the personnel on the bridge could not actually see the bow doors from their vantage point, and there was no indication instruments on the bridge to tell them if the doors were open or not. A huge and obvious oversight that could have solved the problem in an instant. Due to it being such a well-rehearsed operation, Captain David Lurie had just assumed that the doors were closed, and they were ready for the off. Ah, assumption. The mother of all cock-ups. The investigating team were later informed that a similar incident had occurred 4 years earlier, when one of the Herald's sister ships had left Dover with her bow doors left open. But nothing went wrong, and the error was not discovered until they docked in Zeebrugge safe and sound. So this should have still meant that the Herald could have done the same. So what was different? Senior investigators planned to recreate the conditions of the sinking, using one of the Herald's sister ships. Being of the exact same design, it should become obvious if there was any inherent design flaws that contributed to the Herald's swift demise. A large contributing factor was discovered when it was revealed that the extra water in the ballast tanks had not yet been pumped out after she was loading the upper car deck. This left the Herald sitting 1 meter lower in the water than usual. Furthermore, a quirk of hydrodynamics comes into play as the action of the ship moving through the water at speed creates a pressure differential beneath the bow, pulling it slightly more downwards. In deep water, this effect is almost negligible, but the relatively shallow 15-meter depth of the approach to Zeebrugge magnifies the effect by forcing the water between the hull and the seabed to be squeezed much more, rushing out from under the hull faster and thus creating more negative pressure under the bow. This means that the bottom edge of the bow doors were now only 1.5 meters from the waterline. Still very risky, but investigators are not convinced that these factors alone could have caused the disaster. There had to be something else. Testing soon got underway with their sister ship, the Pride of Free Enterprise, recreating the conditions in which the Herald had sailed. A similar load on the car deck, the forward ballast tank filled. The only difference being that this test was in daylight. This time they were not so silly as to leave the bow doors open. With cameras covering the bow from every angle, the test soon revealed the final piece of the puzzle. It was found that under speed, the bow wave generated by the ship moving through the water at between 10 to 15 knots still broke well below the doors. Even as the speed was increased to just under 17 knots, the wave crested over the small step just below the doors, but still flowed away from them. But then, only half a knot faster, at 17.4 knots, the water now began to behave very differently. Not only did the size of the bow wave increase, but it also changed direction. Rather than breaking away from the doors, it flowed backwards and up against the doors. But even so, the wave produced was only 2.5 meters tall, certainly not enough to completely flood the car deck, and so the speed was increased once more, this time to a full 18 knots, the maximum permitted for that stretch of water. It was now, with this further increase in speed, that the shocking truth was revealed clear as day. The bow wave grew exponentially to 4 meters tall, completely engulfing the bow doors in water. This extra half knot of speed was all that was needed to produce a wave more than capable of swamping the car deck in a matter of minutes. Computer-aided modelling of the conditions helped them form a calculation of around 4,000 tons of water every minute would be entering through the open bow doors of the Herald. This then was the awful fait accompli that spelled doom for the Herald of Free Enterprise. In his haste to get back on schedule, Captain Lurie, not knowing anything was amiss, had increased the speed to the maximum allowed. This had created the conditions as already described, and threw up a massive bow wave that allowed thousands of tons of water into the main deck. Normally, a ship of similar size with regular subdivisions across the width of the vessel would have been able to remain afloat with this extra water weight, but with the Herald's car deck being completely open for its full length, the water had free rein to go everywhere. As the load increased, the ship's freeboard decreased, settling her lower and lower, and allowing even greater volumes of water in. Then, with all that water sloshing around the car deck, the Herald's stability and margin of buoyancy became vanishingly less, until finally the severe list over to port became too much for her to recover from, and over she went. This is exactly what had sunk the Herald of Free Enterprise, and led to the deaths of 193 people that dreadful cold March evening. Had it not been for that conveniently located sandbar, the ship would have almost certainly fully inverted and quite possibly completely sunk. That sandbar was the difference between life and death for so many of the Herald's passengers that night. 7 weeks after the disaster, the wreck of the Herald was raised and towed away for scrapping. The outcome of the investigation into the sinking was put down to human error. Captain Lurie was suspended for a year, First Officer Sable for 2 years. Assistant Boatswain Mark Stanley, as the one whose job it was to actually close the doors, escaped further punishment, but was found to be grossly negligent. As for other circumstances, such as the highly pressured nature of haste placed upon the crew to turn the ship around quickly, the UK government fined Townsend Torrenson £400,000, approximately 1.15 million in 2025 money. I cannot help but feel that everyone got off exceedingly lightly here. There should have been jail time for those found to have neglected their duty, in my humble opinion. I'm sure the families of the lost would agree. Legacy. The shocking conclusions drawn from the subsequent inquiry and the massive backlash therefrom would inevitably see Townsend Torrenson go bust. Confidence in them completely collapsed, along with their share price and the cost of the litigation and salvage. However, the 2 remaining sister ships, the Spirit and Pride of Free Enterprise, carried on in service with other ferry companies, albeit much modified due to their sisters' untimely fate, until 2012 and 2015 respectively, before finally being taken out of service and sent off to the breakers' yard. It is just a shame that the majority of major safety improvements only come about as a result from disasters with loss of life to highlight the problems. But then, unfortunately, no one can see into the future. The disaster served as a huge wake-up call for the whole maritime industry, and changes were immediately enacted to improve safety aboard ro-ro type ships. CCTV cameras allow the crew on the bridge to visually observe the status of the bow doors, and indicator lights confirm. Furthermore, Ro-Ro ships must now be fitted with deployable subdividing bulkheads to stop water flowing freely around the ship if it gets in, and ships must be able to stay afloat for at least 30 minutes if they do become flooded. Thankfully, these changes have ensured a much higher safety standard going forward. Survivor Simon Osborne said of the aftermath of the disaster, "The worst aspect of the whole thing was losing my two friends. I didn't expect to lose two close friends at that age. I wanted to meet their parents and tell them about the day we'd had, but instead, I was going to their funerals and memorial services. They were just emotionally draining experiences for an 18 to 19-year-old guy." The at the time middle-aged couple, Michael and Maureen Bennett, who agonized for many hours in the hospital following their rescue about news of their daughter until they finally received the good news that she had been rescued too, said that the disaster had completely altered their outlook on life. Michael said, "If we want to go down the beach or something, we go today. We don't go tomorrow, because tomorrow never comes. It nearly never came for us on that ferry, so we do things when we want to do them. Now." Sage words indeed. It appears to me that the sinking was a mixture of poor management, bad design, great haste demanded by the higher echelons, the crew failing to do their jobs in their entirety, and a series of highly unfortunate events, whilst innocuous on their own, all combined together to cause a catastrophic incident that caused 193 people to lose their lives in the cold waters of the North Sea shipping lanes. That dreadful night on March 6, 1987. Let us hope that all their souls are resting in peace ever after. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to DID for more great content like this. Check out my back catalogue to find even more deep dive videos on the dark side of history. I have made playlists of all my content, so if there's a particular topic you're interested in, I've got you. What did you think of today's topic? Who do you think is to blame? Let me know in the comments. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, or via the Super Thanks button, or you can become a channel member right here on YouTube. And don't forget to check out my merch store if you fancy grabbing yourself some swag. And don't forget you can always hear more from YouTube's foremost sexy voiced narrator by going to DID Reads, where I post extra content such as short stories, poetry, and even children's stories, because why should the kids miss out? And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.